Hello and welcome. This webinar is Preparing Your Child for Back to School. The theme and the goal here is to help your child's improve their ability to handle stress so they better handle this year's transition back to school. I know this is a time of year when historically parents have a lot on their plate. You might be squeezing in that last minute summer vacation. You might be talking to your kiddo. Maybe you've toured your school already. We have a lot of families that just met their teacher recently. And you're wondering, especially this year with COVID, what's going to happen? We don't even know. So there's even more things up in the air this year than in a normal year. And I really want to equip you as a parent to give your child the tools and strategies to really do well this school year. And part of the theme that we're going to do, so turn that off for better audio here. The theme that I want to encourage you is to look at this as a way to empower your child. I know, at least in our office, we see a whole spectrum of kiddos. We see some families that are doing great, and you might be watching this webinar just because you're looking for that one little hint, that one little clue, that one little thing you can modify to help your kiddo succeed. Or you might be on the other side of the spectrum. We see a lot of families in our office whose kiddo is really struggling. Maybe it's extreme ADHD or sensory processing issue, anxiety, autism, something that their brain has to work really hard to get through the day. And I want you to know we're going to help you in that realm as well. With the transition back to school, the challenge becomes that there's so much new for your kiddo. There's a new classroom, new teacher, potentially new students, a new routine coming off summertime when you get to sleep in and kind of do what you want during the day. Now all of a sudden you've got to be structured. And I like to think of it almost as starting a new job. If you picture the last time you had to go to a new job, what happened? You said, well, I want to make sure I'm up early because I'm not quite sure how long it's going to take me to get ready in the morning, and the commute might be a little bit different, and I want to make sure I arrive on time, but not too early, right? And you get to work and you had to decide, do I pack a lunch? Do I eat lunch when I get there? You're meeting new people. You're trying to figure out your new responsibilities. You're in a new building and you're trying to figure out where to go, what room to be in, where your meeting is, if you should be at the computer on a call. And all this new information is coming into your brain, which means your brain and your nervous system have a lot more to process than they normally do. And this is why back to school is a challenging time for so many kiddos, is because of all these new things coming in. So the goal today is we're going to identify the 4 main categories of stress that come at your kiddo's brain and help you then look at 2 things for each of those categories. And this is really the overall theme when it comes to preparing your child for back to school, as well as helping you succeed or your kiddo succeed, basically anything in life. So the 2 focuses that we have are, when it comes to handling stress better, the 2 things we can do are, 1, look at the amount of stress pushing down in our life. And as I mentioned, there's 4 main categories we're going to look at today. What those are mental emotional stress, chemical stress, physical stress, and technological stress. So if you want to handle stress better, one thing you can do is start to minimize the amount of stresses in your life. If you can drop some of the stresses, things go better. However, we know that we can only take away so many stresses, right? Your child, maybe they don't like riding the bus, but they still have to ride the bus if they're going to get to school. Maybe your kiddo hates taking math class, but to succeed and move on, they need to take math and need to test through it. So there's only so many stresses we can get rid of, which means the next piece of the equation is helping your body handle stress better. And this is one of the things that we are experts at in our office, is looking at your internal resiliency to handling stress. And this is one of the things we love to do with our kiddos in the office, as well as our adults, is help them identify how they can actually handle stress better. So if you're in the same situation, you do better. Just a real quick example, I was actually sharing it with a practice member this morning. Years ago, we had a woman come in who was sick all the time, and she would get lots of colds all winter, and she would have multiple rounds of strep throat. So much so that the doctor said, if you keep having strep throat, we're going to have to take your tonsils out. And the reason she thought this is that she worked at a daycare, which meant there was lots of kids bringing lots of germs into her environment all the time. However, what we found is that there are some areas we could support her with, so we started adjusting her. Fast forward, she gets through her first winter after being adjusted, and she didn't get sick at all, and she didn't get strep throat at all. Maybe she had like a little bitty cold. And she gets to the springtime and she gives me a high five. She says, Dr. Ty, I didn't get sick this winter and no strep throat. So the key with that is that in that situation, we didn't actually take away the stress because she still worked at the daycare. So she was still around as many kids, bringing as many bugs to her. But what we did is boosted her ability to handle stress. And I really want to emphasize this because that's what I think a lot of parents come to us because they get stuck and thinking like, we've done it all. What else can we do? And this is often the missing link, is creating more resilience inside your child's body. So let's dive in then with the first of the 4 topics. So the physical category is something that is one of the stresses that the brain has to deal with. Now, what I want to do as we dive into each of these 4 categories, as I said, is I want to give you some tips and strategies amongst each one. And you might find some of these, you're going to be like, ooh, that's going to be awesome for my kiddo. Some you might say, oh, we're kind of doing that already. And that's great. The goal is to empower you to empower your kiddo to do better. So I want to emphasize physical stress is going to come in 2 forms when it comes to back to school. Number 1 might be athletics, which is what we commonly think of like running around. You slip, you fall, you get the bumps and bruises. However, the overlooked one that we're going to emphasize today is from posture and being now stuck in a desk, looking at an iPad or a computer for potentially way more time than your kiddo did during the summer. In the summertime, more likely that they're going to be outside playing around, active on the playground, less screen time. And we're going to talk about some specific screen time strategies here near the end. But for right now, the goal is to say, okay, well, if I'm a kiddo and I'm suddenly in this posture all day long, what does that do to my brain and my nervous system? Think about the last time you felt really happy, really proud. Maybe you got a promotion at work. Maybe you had an amazing family get-together. Celebration. My son just turned 1 last week, so we had a little bit before that a really fun birthday party. Made me really proud as a dad to have a 1-year-old. Now think about the last time you were really happy and proud. What was your posture like? My guess is it wasn't like this. My guess is that you were upright, you were standing tall, you had a good smile on your face. And the reason this is that our moods and our posture are very closely related. If we're happy and proud, we tend to be more upright. If we're sad, depressed, down, we tend to naturally go into that slump position. But here's the critical thing. It can happen in either order. What I mean by this is, let's say your mood's kind of neutral, and suddenly you do stand up a little taller. Your brain is going to get signals from your body up into your brain saying, we must actually be in a better mood than I thought today. And it's going to start to brighten your mood. Because your brain and your kiddo's brain receives a tremendous amount of information from the body. So if it's receiving information from the posture of your body that you're happy, you're going to be happier. On the flip side, let's say your kiddo's in kind of a neutral mood, but suddenly they go into this posture for several hours in a day. And what is that going to do to their brain? Now their brain's going to go the other direction and think, maybe I'm not in as good as a mood as I thought I was. Maybe I should be a little more grumpy. Maybe I should be a little more depressed, a little more anxious. So the body can feed the brain and cause it to go either direction. So strategy number 1 in this physical stress category is something that we call victory pose. What this is putting your child into a posture, and this is one I recommend doing in the morning before school to get their brain ready for the day, is to get them in a position where they stand big and tall and they look up toward the ceiling or toward the sky. And standing there for 30 seconds to a minute, what that does, and if we look from the side, it's opening me up. It's helping me stand tall and open instead of closed and worried. If your kiddo struggles with anxiety or nervousness, this is a critical pose for them because when we're nervous, we often want to shy away. We want to withdraw. We want to protect. And if we're in that motion, in that posture, it tells our brain to continue that momentum. If we open up, it helps to open our brain up. The second piece that I want to mention here in the physical stress category is how to use movement. We know that exercise is really good for the brain. So the two types of movement that will help power our brain up are big movements and small movements. If you think of running around outside, that tends to be the big movements. We call that gross motor. And that is really good for academic things. If your child has to study for a test, if they're trying to learn something new, it is really good for powering their brain up for learning. On the flip side, if we go to the other type of movement, we have fine motor. And then I'll tell you how best to use these. Fine motor is really good actually for emotions and emotional processing. If you have ever heard of something like art therapy, it's having a kiddo or an adult, but let's say a kiddo is doing a drawing while they're working with their therapist. One of the reasons this works is that it's engaging the fine motor. Drawing as a fine motor activity, playing a musical instrument, even talking, as you see me here, I'm using my hands and my mouth. All these fine motor activities help the emotional processing side of our brain. So how to work with these two is step one is if your child is stressed, sometimes it's nice to do a big movement. Have them go run around outside, play on the playground, throw the ball. The nice thing, like say throwing the ball is kind of a combination of the two. But if you do a big movement, you get some of the adrenaline out of your system, help calm things back down. So if your child is stressed, maybe you do that first and then have them do some drawing while you're talking it out. Or like I said, playing catch. Your eyes are tracking the ball. You've got these little movements with your hands. Playing catch is a good way to do a little bit of both if you need to process and talk something out with your child. If your child has a big test they need to study for and you want to set their brain up for a state of learning, have them run around outside first and then come back in and study. So those are the two pieces in category number one. Physical stress is that using victory pose, opening up, and you can do that with your kiddo, helps get your brain in a state of happy, proud, excited, and confident. And then number two, acknowledging the difference between fine motor and gross motor to know which physical movement to do for what your kiddo needs. All right, so that is the physical category. We've got two strategies there. Number two, we are going to go to the mental and emotional stress category. The big thing focusing on here actually has to do now with routines, because we know that, as I mentioned before, changes in our environment make our brain have to perceive that change and do something about it. So we go from summer routine to school routine, and this is where a lot of kiddos get stuck or become suddenly stubborn or defiant or want a lot of control. And as a parent, you might be wondering like, hey, yesterday he was fine with me picking out his clothes. Today he's not. Or yesterday he was fine if we did this first and then this one second. And today it feels like things have to be in the exact precise order. And if one gets missed, suddenly the whole thing falls apart and my kiddo has a meltdown. So in the mental and emotional category here, I want to share 3 things you can do that are actually from my wife. My wife is Samantha Moe, and Mad to Glad is her program. And so I've got notes here to share these 3 strategies with you. But she is an expert at helping parents. She's a parent coach, so helping parents find tips and strategies and tools to help navigate intense kiddos. So the key with this is that anytime your kiddo feels stressed inside, they're going to want more control outside. So the more worried or nervous they feel about school, the more potentially overwhelmed they feel about school, the more concerned they are about what the kids are going to think of them or what's going to happen or unpredictability at school, the more now that feeling inside is going to want to come out, and they're going to want to have control in the external environment. This is one of the reasons why suddenly routines, like, they need to have a say in it. So the first strategy my wife shares is asking I wonder questions in advance. So I'm going to write this down for you. Asking an I wonder question. What this means is you're asking your kiddo, I wonder how the bus ride's going to go. And let them talk. Hey, I wonder what your friend is going to be wearing tomorrow. Let them talk. I wonder when it's time for lunch, I wonder what the lunch line is going to be like when you stand in line. And by asking I wonder questions, what it does is it helps open up your child's brain to look at things ahead of time. Now, the key, she said, is as a parent, you might want to dive in and explain everything you know. So the key with this strategy is to ask the question and then just step back and let your kid answer. Avoid answering for your kiddo and saying, well, I bet the lunch line is going to be just fine. You won't be nervous at all. Or I'll bet you're going to be able to sit by your favorite friend at the lunch table and there'll be a seat saved for you. Because their brain might be thinking, well, I don't know, maybe there won't be a seat at the lunch table for me. And you want them to be able to express that, process it, and let it out. Number 2 is to actually give your child opportunities for control. And this, as I mentioned before, is if your child's feeling stressed internally, they're going to want control externally. So where can you give them opportunities for control? What my wife gives us some examples here is maybe let them choose their clothes, what they're going to eat for breakfast, what music they're going to listen to on if you drive them to school, what music they're going to listen to in the car ride. And by giving them choices of control, it allows them to feel some control, because there's a lot of areas when we go back to school that they don't have control over, right? They still have to go to school even if they don't want to. They still have to go to classes, do homework, take tests, things that they might not want to do. So they feel like they're losing control in certain categories. So you want to give them control in the categories that you can. What she recommends avoiding here is that if you do this in the moment, it might not get you out the door in time, right? Because if you do it the morning of, you say, okay, what clothes do you want to wear? What do you want to eat for breakfast? What music do you want to listen to? And your kiddo's taking a little bit of time to make that decision. You might panic and say, sorry, we need to get out the door. You're going to eat this, and we're going to listen to this, and you're going to wear this, and boom, you rush them through the process. So one of the keys here is to do it the night before, because now you've got as much space and as much time as you need, and it actually helps your kiddo when they're going to bed to be able to kind of feel that going to bed in control, that they're like, okay, yep, I've got some predictability tomorrow. I've got some things that I know exactly what's going to happen. Helps them start to process things already when they're sleeping at night, and then wake up ready to go in the morning. All right. And then number 3 is setting a positive expectation. So the third strategy, setting positive expectation, is you want to see how many seeds you can plant in your kiddo's brain of something that will go well. So an example here, like after school, after your first day tomorrow, what fun activity should we do no matter what? And it gets your kiddo's brain kind of thinking like, okay, no matter what happens during school, I'm going to have something fun to do with my mom or my dad afterward. And it gets their brain into that positive expectation mode. When they know there's going to be something fun, that it doesn't matter, as an example, what happens during the day, their brain has something to look forward to, something to link to. And the thing to avoid in this situation is avoid threatening to remove things if things don't go as well as you want to. So your kiddo, let's say, you say, what fun things should we do after school no matter what? And they say, I want to play catch in the backyard for 30 minutes. The thing to avoid here is threatening to remove, like, okay, well, if you don't behave, remember, we're not going to get to play catch, because you want to really get that positive expectation moving forward. So, mental emotional category, to sum things up here to help with the transition and the routine, is ask with your child I wonder questions, get them thinking ahead and letting them be able to express any worries. Number 2, giving them opportunities for control the night before. And then 3, set a positive expectation. What is something that you can do together after school, as an example there, that they have a reward to move toward rather than taking away or punishing. All right, so we've got 2 categories left here. So we just covered physical stress, mental emotional stress. We're going to go real brief on chemical stress and then spend more time on the technology stress. With this one, not only to help your kiddo process screen time, but also here we're going to talk about sleep and getting a deeper night's sleep. So chemical stress, 3rd category here. And this one we're going to stay real brief. When it comes to chemical stress, it tends to be in the category of what food should I eat, what vitamins should I take, what minerals. And what I found over the years is that a lot of these supplements, vitamins, minerals, you actually want to have someone like individually testing your body for. So that's like in our household, what we do is we see someone that does typically muscle testing. Over the years, sometimes we've done a blood test. Ultimately, we're saying like, okay, here's what your body needs based on your circumstance. And so when it comes to the chemical side, what I would just briefly say is over the years, we haven't found like a one size fits all. Meaning, okay, if you want your kid to pay better attention, they need omega-3 oil. Like, yeah, some kids do great with fish oil, some it doesn't really make a difference. So being able to test is a way better way to make those decisions. What I will emphasize in the chemical stress category is that something like omega-3s does help the brain in general, but it doesn't mean you have to take a supplement for it. And when we look at foods that can then stress the brain, and we talked about those down arrows earlier, the biggest ones that I see in the chemical category tend to be in the processed food realm. Typically because they're adding dyes, preservatives, flavors, colors. I guess I already said dyes, but they're adding some artificial things that our brain and our nervous system aren't used to processing. And as a result, it causes our brain to spend more energy digesting, which pulls from our brain. So if you can avoid processed foods as much as possible, and then if you are giving your kiddo processed food, just look through the ingredient list and kind of say, do I know these ingredients? For example, some kiddos with ADHD, if they have a certain dye, like a food coloring, it spikes their hyperactivity. And if they don't have that, their nervous system is a lot calmer because that's one thing that their nervous system is sensitive to. So just make sure you're reading through the labels and minimizing processed foods. And if it is processed, try to minimize those artificial things. If your kiddo likes Hawaiian punch, and maybe that has a certain food coloring in, I haven't looked at the ingredient list for a while, or a certain corn syrup, look to see if you can switch them to a juice that has natural colors and apple juice as the sweetener. So, all right. Lastly then, we're going to jump into technology. And as I said on this one, cover things that will help your kiddo work out the energy that can get pent up if they're on screens a lot, and then set them up for a good night's sleep. In order to understand the strategy here, there's something that is called a sensory motor loop. So what does this have to do with screens? Well, it goes back to our brain, as I was talking about before. It receives information from our body. That is the sensory side of things. So our brain receives information. It receives sight, it receives sound, smell, taste, touch, and internal senses as well. The sensory motor loop, what this means is that if our brain receives a lot of sensory input, there has to be an output. So if sensory is on the way in, Motor now is movement. If you think of a motor moves a vehicle, motors move things. So motor is an output, something that our brain then tells our body to do. So why do kiddos get thrown off when they're on a lot of screens is because which side are screens? Screens are a ton of sensory input because of all the stimulation into our eyes and our ears. The different things that researchers have looked at with screens, and I forget the exact number, but basically the amount of inputs coming in via screen is many times more than the inputs coming into our eyes if we're out in nature and in an environment, even with other people, other kids, even if we're on the playground and it's really busy out. Like our brains are designed to process all that versus a screen. If you think about watching a show, it's like all these things are changing so fast. Maybe you're changing scenes, changing characters, jumping around, and it's a ton of sensory input into the brain at the same time that you're sitting there. You're not moving, which means your body's missing out on the motor output. Now, so picture like watching screens all day at, let's say your kiddo is in at a grade where they're on their iPad a lot, they're on their computer a lot at school, they're getting all this input, and now they come home and they say, Mom, I need a break from school. Can I play video games before my homework? Sure, it sounds like a reasonable thing. They just worked all day at school. You know, you want to reward them. So they want to play some video games before homework. Well, guess what? Now they're just adding even more input in that sensory realm, again, without a motor output. So the critical thing here is that you have to give your kiddo the chance to dump some of this energy and get the motor outputs going, which is by movement. By maybe you do some jumping jacks, playing outside in recess, throwing the ball around. Even it's going to be a lot better motor output. Let's say your kiddo likes to sew or do a jigsaw puzzle. Even that is some movement with like a low level of sensory input. So it's going to give their brain a chance to catch up. In this realm, then, what I recommend doing is when your kiddo does get home from school, maybe they need a snack, maybe they need a little like just kind of lying quiet time. So the things you can do to support them are either some quiet time, because that's going to decrease the sensory piece rather than more screen time. And then number two, getting them some sort of movement to work things through. Now, before they move into homework or the evening or whatever other activities you're going to do, they've got some chance to reset themselves and not just have a one-sided piece. Along those same lines is as we get closer to bedtime, you might have heard that you don't want to have screens an hour or two before bed. This is one of the reasons why, is that if you do screens right before bed, again, it's going to bombard this area, and you're not necessarily going to encourage your child like, all right, you got 15 minutes before bed, go run around outside for 15 minutes, because you don't want to hype up all their energy right before bed. So if you do screens right before bed, it's really tough to be able to dump that energy with the motor piece. And so that's reason number one, I guess, why you want that hour or two before bed without screens. And as we're going through this, I want to transition into the getting your child good sleep. And thank you so much for your comments, my cow. Thanks for watching, and I'm glad you're learning a lot when you watch our videos here, my videos. So transition, as I said, now back into better sleep. So avoiding screen times helps with this sensory motor loop. It helps make sure that your child's brain isn't just all revved up with a bunch of sensory input. The second thing that avoiding screens before bed does is helps with blue light, because, and this is, I'd say, a lot more common knowledge now, but just in case you don't know, what happens is when we have a lot of screen time, we get a lot of blue light, which can decrease our melatonin production. And melatonin is what our brain releases to help us calm down at night. In order to increase melatonin, then, a couple things that you can do. Number one is decreasing screens, especially a couple hours before bed. Two, if you do have to do something on the computer, make sure there's different settings you can do on the computer to help decrease, like put it in the night mode, and it will decrease the blue light being emitted. emitted. At home, I have some glasses that they look like safety goggles basically, and they're an orange tint that I put over my regular glasses, and that helps drop blue light. And then the other thing you can do earlier in the day to help melatonin production is if you get sunlight into your eyes in the morning, it helps your brain make more melatonin in the evening. One of the critical reasons that sleep is so important for kiddos is more than just physically resting the body. I know myself for years, I thought like, well, I know sleep, if I'm physically tired or if I'm mentally tired, I want to get sleep to rejuvenate my body, my mind the next day. However, there's a really cool book. It's called Why We Sleep. Matthew Walker is the author. And what he goes into is all this research the brain science is showing of what our brain's doing while we're sleeping to wire and make better connections. This means that if your kiddo, let's say they're playing sports, what they found is that actually in the last hour or two of your whole sleep cycle is when your brain is integrating movement patterns. So we were talking about motor before. So let's say your kiddo's trying to practice a certain form for his baseball swing, or he's trying to kick the ball a certain way in soccer. Your brain, if your kiddo practices that a bunch during the day, the last hour or two of sleep is when your kiddo's brain is integrating and it's taking the neurons and the dendrites and it's making all these new synaptic connections in the brain to make your kiddo able to do that even better the next day. So sleep is helping with the motor integration. And then the other thing sleep is helping with is connect all the sensory experiences and also what your kiddo learns. I remember when I was I'm guessing it was 8th grade, and it was the first time we had to memorize a short story and read it in front of the class. And I chose Jack and the Beanstalk, and I was reading away and I was trying to remember, okay, here's the intro, here's theme number 1 and number 2, here's the end, and trying to remember each paragraph, and I'm reading it over and over and over and over again, and I'd read it and I'd set it down, then I'd try to say it out loud, and I'd be getting close but not quite. And my tendency in school sometimes was try to cram it in. So here I am the day before, I have to read Jack and the Beanstalk out loud to the whole class without any notes or any pages, any book. I have to have it memorized. And I'm like, it's just not clicking. And so I'm doing it over and over and over again. And finally I'm like, well, I got to get some sleep. I'm not going to learn anymore right now because I'm tired. So I put it away, fall asleep. I wake up in the morning and I knew it word for word. I didn't have to look at it again in the morning. I'm lying there in bed. I kind of lift my head out of bed. I'm like, and I knew the whole thing. The reason this is that while I was sleeping at night, my brain was integrating all that information. So this is one of the reasons that sleep is so important for your kiddos, is because if they're trying to learn something during the day, the way they actually integrate it in their brain is at night when they're sleeping. And one of the really cool things that the book found is that it's not just that one night either. To illustrate this, they actually had a group of adults learn something, and they said, all right, a week later, how much do you remember? And they figured out that amount. They had a group of adults then, they learned something, and they had a few alcoholic drinks that night. I think it was 3. They found then a week later, they only remembered 50% of the group who didn't have the drinks. And they traced it back and they said, oh, okay, the reason is while they learned that, and even though they had the drinks later in the day, that night when they were sleeping, their brain didn't get as good of sleep, so they didn't integrate that information to be able to remember it the next week. I said, okay, that makes sense. But the cool thing that they did next is they took the group again. They said, okay, we're going to teach you something on Wednesday. You're not going to have anything to drink on Wednesday or Thursday. And they did 2 or 3 days later. Now they had a few alcoholic drinks. And guess what? They still lost 40% of the information the following week. And what they realized is that when we learn something during the day, our brain is sure it's integrating it that night, but they said they found so far at least up to a week, the brain is still integrating information you learned the week prior. Again, why sleep is so critical. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that if your kiddo is feeling frustrated, or they feel like, Dad, I've been trying this for so long, I just don't get it. I'm never going to get it. Give them that encouragement that guess what? Their brain is still integrating things that it was working on way here. It's still a week later. It's still working on integrating it and learning it better. So the last piece then before we wrap up with sleep and technology has to do with now allowing, let's say your kiddo does fall asleep, they've got some good melatonin, they put their head down, they fall asleep. Now we want to help them get into that deep sleep where they can do the most integrating. So in order to do this, one of the things we do at our house is we want to minimize all the EMFs, so things from technology that can interfere with our brain sleep. So this would be Wi-Fi, cell phone signal, Bluetooth, all the messages that technology is using to communicate. And it's great for communication, but it is not great for our sleep at night. Our nervous system has a certain wavelengths that it communicates in to regulate sleep, digestion, immune system, and there's a certain range of those wavelengths. What we found is that, like, say, radio waves. If the range our brain uses is here, radio waves are actually like way out of that range, so they don't really interfere with us too much. However, the EMFs that I just mentioned, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, they're within that same range, and that's why they have a bigger impact on our nervous system, why they can stress our nervous system out more. There is a husband and wife that we've worked with in our office, in our home, that have worked with other families that we know, and there was one family that they worked with in particular whose son would always wake up grumpy. He was about 8 years old at the time, and it felt like no matter what parents did, he'd wake up really grumpy in the morning and like kind of start the whole day off rough. When they went out to his house, they had some technology. They've got meters, they can measure the intensity of these things, and they found their house was just getting bombarded. They did things to eliminate it, and suddenly he was waking up in the morning like bright and cheery and ready to go for the day. And that is an example of, if these stresses are on our brain at night, it can really impact the quality of our sleep. So in their case, they had a kiddo that already was sensitive, and they had a huge amount of this EMF stress pushing down, and it had a big impact. However, in your case, maybe your kiddo's not super sensitive, and maybe you don't have a ton, but together they are still going to impact your child's quality of sleep, which impacts their ability to learn and integrate. So in our house, what we do is we have our Wi-Fi, our modem router, all plugged into its own power strip. So when we go to bed at night, we just flip off that power strip, shuts them all down because we don't need that while we're sleeping, and it maybe it helps your kiddo from rolling over in the middle of the night if for some reason they do wake up and they wanted to play on their electronics. So that's one thing we do, is turn off the power strip with all those things in it. The next thing we do is we have our phones out in a different room because we don't use them as an alarm clock. But that's something that if you do use your phone as an alarm clock, if you turn on airplane mode, and with airplane mode, just making sure it has the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth off, that allows, again, those signals not to be transmitting all night, because your cell phone's always looking for the nearest cell phone tower. It's looking for the nearest Wi-Fi, and even if you're not receiving a call, it's still always searching, which zaps our brain. And the thing you really want to avoid is if for some reason you do need your phone in your room, don't have it on your bedside close to your head, because that's going to have the biggest impact there. So those are things that we want to do to really emphasize minimizing those electronics at night. And then lastly, as we wrap up then, is I mentioned before, we've got the different stresses. So that's what we just covered. We've got mental, emotional, chemical, physical, and we just touched on electronics to help sleep. The last piece then is, what can you do to increase your reserves from within? Well, we know that all these stresses, when they add up, they start to stress the brain. And it's almost like a circuit breaker where now your brain's not as well connected to your body. This is what we actually do with our office to build reserves. And I'll give you an example here. This was a 5-year-old kiddo. And what we found with her is that she had a lot of stress around other kiddos. So mom said since she was young, she did fine with adults, but not so good with other kiddos. She'd be nervous and anxious and not want to interact with them. So much so that parents had spoken to their teacher, and the teacher said, oh, maybe she'll outgrow it. They tried different doctors, didn't really get a good response. So when we did our scans in our office, this is a thermal scan, so it's very gentle, nothing goes in the body. We were able to look for where those circuits were blown. Basically, where those circuits were blown were areas that there was more stress than her brain could handle, and her brain wasn't able to properly communicate good health, good calm with her body. We started adjusting her, and you can see the follow-up here. We still have some to work up on top here, but it's so much improved. And mom noticed the cool thing here is that now she actually went up to other kiddos and started interacting with them. And she's like, oh, we've tried things for so many years, and this was over a 6-week period. Her daughter had this really cool transformation because we were able to remove some of that stress internally that was stressing her brain out. In her case, her parents were doing this phenomenal job of trying to eliminate all the stress from the outside, and they did a really good job at controlling some of that stress. But what we found with our scans is that there was actually stress coming from inside the body that was preventing her from making good progress. So that's the last piece, is that if you want to give your child that next level of support, we'd love to be able to take a look in the office. That's something that we're very passionate about, is helping parents identify if there are hidden stresses in their kiddo's body. And if there are, what can we do to clear them out? And now that also is going to help them handle transitions so much easier. We see like one 8-year-old girl we worked with used to take an hour to get dressed in the morning. After adjusting her for a month, suddenly she was getting ready in 15 minutes. So guess what? That made school transition time way easier because we allowed her body to start to send some calm and organization into her brain, and she didn't have to work so hard from the outside. All right, friends, that is what I have for you today. If you have any questions, reach out. If you're watching this on the recording, which I know a lot of you are, and you thought, hey, what about this? Feel free to put a question in the comment, and I am happy to support you any way we can. If you're interested to see what scans look like, reach out for that as well, and we'll see if we can help. So thanks for your likes, thanks for your hearts, thanks for your shares, and I'll talk to you guys later.